Good afternoon, students. So continuing with our last lecture, I'll just share the slide with you. So we were discussing, the use of the word traditional in these definitions is often seen as problematic, right? So the possible explanations for that could be that, traditional is more related to at times stereotyped as being rigid, stereotyped as being old fashioned, and not that linked with science. However, if you read and if you go through, if you delve deeper into traditional environmental knowledge, you will realize that there is a lot of logic, there is a lot of science, there is a lot of reasoning in what they believe in, right? So it's not only dependent on what they heard, it is time tested knowledge, it is practically applied and tested knowledge, right? So moving further. So talking about indigenous knowledge. Now, indigenous knowledge, as I have already elaborated on the word indigenous and its various meanings, right? So let's take a look at the formal definition and then we'll break it and discuss it further. So indigenous knowledge includes facts, concepts, theories about the characteristics which describe the objects, events, behaviors, and interconnections that comprise both the animate and inanimate environments of indigenous peoples, right? So indigenous peoples, like I told you, the people who are native to a particular place, right, who did not come and shift from somewhere outside, they had been staying in that particular place, in that particular area since the beginning. All right, so come on, that is really funny. I mean, marking this, it like makes you feel very cool. It's hard to believe you are third year students. थर्ड ईयर में ही हो ना सारे? यस और नो?
मैम
थर्ड ईयर या फर्स्ट ईयर था नहीं है पक्का? ऑल राइट, सो आई होप यू डोंट डू दैट अगेन.
पता नहीं कितने की पर मैंने की था.
So how come the strength has dwindled quite a lot? It was quite promising in the morning. So by this time, do you feel tired of attending all the classes? Hanji, yes or no? So I'll just take a screenshot of those who are present. All right, so coming back here. So again, that includes facts, concepts, theories, right? And the characteristics which describe objects, events. कुछ भी event हुआ है, कोई behavior है, कुछ interconnections and natural events कुछ हो रहे हैं, उसके पीछे क्या theories हैं, क्या facts हैं, क्या concepts हैं. For example, if there are floods, what is the reasoning behind those, right? If there is, let's say, drought, what is the reasoning behind that? All that is, the part of indigenous knowledge. All right. So even though indigenous knowledge is not quantitative in nature, it does not mean that it is not precise. This is exactly what I was saying, that it might not be quantified, it might not be quantifiable, right? It might not be documented, but that does not mean that it is not precise or it is not logical or it is not reasonable. All right, so let's move further. So characteristics of indigenous knowledge, right? So let's one by one go through these characteristics and I'll elaborate wherever I feel the need for. So it is generated within communities, that is quite clear. It is location and culture specific. Again, if you think logically, now a particular community which is staying in a particular area, the indigenous knowledge that they possess is going to be relevant for that particular area only. It won't be relevant for any other area. Why? Because every area has its own climate, its own vegetation, own type of soil. यही होता है ना, जैसे पंजाब में डिफरेंट टाइप ऑफ क्लाइमेट है, राजस्थान में डिफरेंट है, हमारे इधर डिफरेंट क्रॉप्स ग्रो होते हैं, सॉइल अलग है, राजस्थान में भी जो वहां पे सूटेबल होगा वो दैट दोस क्रॉप्स आर ग्रोन, राइट? Similarly, we have so much variation in the climate, in the weather as well. So इसीलिए जो यहाँ के लोग जो बहुत पहले से रह रहे हैं, उनको जो यहाँ एरिया का पता होगा, that is specific to this area, that is specific to this culture. All right. So coming back here, now another characteristic is that it is the basis for decision making and survival strategies. Again, if you think, with common sense, of course, this is the knowledge they'll be using for their daily decision making. Let's say if they have to plan whether to, travel somewhere or not within that area, of course, then they are going to check the climate, they're going to check the weather for the day, and they have their own cues for checking the weather. अब अगर इसका मैं आपको एक एग्जांपल दूं, जो रिस्ट वॉच है वो वाली इन्वेंशन तो हमें बहुत देर बाद आई है, राइट? सो रिस्ट वॉचेस बिकेम ubiquitous, like we are wearing it every day. Each one of us might be owning a wrist watch. ये काफी लेटर की बात है, बट ये तो बात नहीं है कि पहले टाइम ही नहीं पता था लोगों को, राइट? दे हैड अ वे ऑफ गेटिंग टू नो द टाइम, हाउ लॉन्ग इज इट टिल सनसेट, थ्रू देयर ओन मेथड्स, राइट? सो आपने वो सन डायल्स देखे होंगे जैसे जंतर मंतर में है, right? So those help them as per the shadow of the sun, the length of the shadow. Then even at night, whenever it used to be bright moonlight, so they used to check from the shadow of the moon. That is how they knew, right? That is how they even knew the directions, right? Even like जैसे stars की बात करते हैं, ठीक है? पहले टाइम पे भी लोग शिप से इधर उधर जाते थे, पर तब नेविगेशन सिस्टम इतना एडवांस नहीं था जैसे अब है. अब एवरीथिंग इज वेरी digital, technology driven, right? We are all relying on technology rather than human sight, human oversight, right? So are you unable to hear me? Yes, Manav. All right, so I guess there must be some network issue. So what about others? Are you able to hear me well? Yes, what about Karan, Charanpreet? Okay, it's clear now. All right. Right, so we were talking about navigation. So again, there were all these methods even before technology came in, and all this is included in indigenous knowledge, right? And this is how they survived for so long. If the species of human being, Homo sapiens, they were not intelligent enough, they were not ready to adapt, we would have perished long back, right? We were ready to adapt, we were ready to change ourselves, we were ready to adjust to the changing environment, and that is how we have been able to survive for so long, right? Now again, it is, since it is indigenous knowledge, more passed on from one generation to another, it has not been systematically documented. However, we will come back to the current efforts being put in by the government, being put in by various NGOs and these cultural groups to completely make a proper record of what we know of the traditional knowledge, right? Then concerns critical issues of human and animal life, primary production, human and animal life, natural resource management, right? So it also deals with all these issues. Then we have, it is dynamic and based on innovation, adaptation, and experimentation, right? Dynamic is opposite of static. Static is something which has stopped, it is stable, it is there. However, dynamic is something which is always changing, right? So again, indigenous knowledge is, it is not static, it has not stopped growing, it is always being updated. So even if these people do not have a system to document it, that does not mean that the knowledge stopped growing or evolving. It has evolved with time, right? Then another key point is based on innovation, adaptation, and experimentation. So yes, these people, they might not have had access to proper formal knowledge or college like you guys. Like you guys are here, you are pursuing this mechanical engineering, so you would definitely know more about whatever core subjects you are studying, right? So you are also applying them practically in your labs or whenever you go for your industrial trainings. However, in this case, even if it was not formally there, it was based on innovation, it was based on new ideas, it was based on adaptation, trial and hit method, right? So trial and error method. So whatever works, that is being followed. Whatever does not work, that is being discarded. So this is how the knowledge is being continuously updated, right? And of course, experimentation. Only if practically something is possible, that is why they would, adopt that. Otherwise, they would let it be. Then it is oral and rural in nature. Again, oral means there is no written document. It has survived by word of mouth from one generation to another, and it is rural in nature as well. Again, because urban, the word urban connotes something else, right? So the urban areas of today, they stand for something else. They stand for proper development. They stand for the city area where people are engaged in particular occupations, not in those primary activities like agriculture, mining, or fishing. They are more dealing with, manufacturing, with service providing, right? So this is why this is what is urban area, and the rural area, on the other hand, is where people are still following these pursuits. They are more closely, dependent on nature itself rather than on these industries or man-made structures, right? So indigenous knowledge is, again, it is more of a rural pursuit of those areas and not of the urban areas. All right. So the social context. Now, since time immemorial, we were put here to take care of the land. Our grandfathers did not abuse the land, and it is our turn to pass our knowledge on to our younger generation. What our forefathers kept all this time is very precious. It's now in our hands, right? So our creator has given us the responsibility for taking very good care of what we have. And if we don't take care of it, we will lose our own culture one day, right? So the social context, now let's understand all these words. These are words from John Pantagumscum, I think that is how they pronounce it, in McDonald, right? And these are from one of the research papers which has been written on this topic, right? So I'll just give you a moment to read through these words and then I'll elaborate on the same. So again, now this person, this particular researcher, what does he say? He says that, we have been given this land. We do not own it. We are simply the custodians, right? So custodian is somebody who's a caretaker. कि वो चीज आपकी नहीं है, आपने सिर्फ उसकी देखभाल करनी है, right? And our grandfathers see. Now, if we are to talk about natural resources, nobody owns them in particular. This is what is the whole debate about. That we have exploited them as if we own them, but we do not, right? So it is only passed from one generation to another, and each generation is supposed to do their bit. They are supposed to take care of what they have got from nature, and actually not just to take away from it, but also give back in some form, right? So we are here only to take care of it. And if our obviously the previous generations did not abuse it as much, and this is our turn, our responsibility to pass the same knowledge to the younger generation, the next generation, and maintain the same respect for nature, right? And what our forefathers kept all this time is very precious. See, अब उस टाइम पे क्लाइमेट चेंज का कोई आइडिया नहीं था. उस टाइम पे टेम्परेचर राइज, ग्लोबल वार्मिंग, एक्सट्रीम क्लाइमेट इवेंट्स, इन सब का कोई आइडिया नहीं था कि फ्लैश फ्लड्स आ रहे हैं, क्लाउड बर्स्ट हो रहा है, राइट? इस बार आपने नोटिस किया होगा न्यूज में, इफ यू आर रीडिंग न्यूज रेगुलरली, कितने ज्यादा हमारे लैंडस्लाइड्स हुए हैं इन हिमाचल एज वेल एज उत्तराखंड. So all that is a sign of something. It is a sign of overburdening the ecology. It is a sign of disturbing that natural balance, right? So even if the people back then, they did not have so much development, yet they knew the value of nature that they have, right? And similarly, now it is in our hands. Our creator has given us the responsibility for taking very good care of what we have. If we don't take care of it, we will lose our own culture one day. So again, the culture, nature, this traditional knowledge, it is a treasure to be saved. It is a treasure to be preserved, right? It is not something to be squandered away, right? So this is what is the complete message. So even socially, that is linked with your identity, right? So the Indian traditional knowledge, क्यों हम इतना आजकल गवर्नमेंट को इतना योगा को बचाने का क्यों है, या इवन जो ट्रेडिशनल नॉलेज है फॉर लेट्स से आयुष एंड अदर सच होम्योपैथी, उसको डॉक्यूमेंट किया जा रहा है, उसको सेव किया जा रहा है. दे हैव मेड अ कंप्लीट depository of such knowledge, a library, digital library for such knowledge. Why? Because we do not want it to be lost forever. अगर मैंने आपको सिंपल एग्जांपल देना हो, जैसे लैंग्वेज है कोई भी, अगर लोग वो लैंग्वेज नहीं बोलेंगे, ग्रेजुअली क्या होएगा, उसके स्पीकर्स कम होते जाएंगे। ठीक है, पहली जनरेशन आई जो सारे उस लैंग्वेज में बात कर रहे हैं। पंजाब की अगर बात करते हैं, ठीक है, सो वी हैव लेट्स से हिंदी एंड पंजाबी, दीज आर द मोस्ट वाइड स्प्रेड लैंग्वेजेस हियर। Then there is this generation coming in and subsequent generations who are more attracted to let's say speaking in English rather than Hindi or Punjabi. तो उसमें क्या होगा, gradually the languages they start vanishing, उसके speakers कम रह जाते हैं, एक जनरेशन एफर्ट नहीं करती कि नेक्स्ट जनरेशन को भी सिखाना है, एंड दैट इज हाउ दे ग्रेजुअली लूज टच विद इट। अगर हम बात करें एनआरआईज की, राइट, सो हाउ मेनी ऑफ यू हैव रिलेटिव्स अब्रॉड? सो यू कैन रिप्लाई इन द चैट। You can just say yes or no. So yes, how many of you have cousins abroad or family abroad in Canada, US, Australia, New Zealand, right? हाँ जी बच्चे, so how many of you have relatives abroad? Nobody? I am surprised. Are you sure? किसी का भी कोई रिलेटिव बाहर नहीं रहता? हाँ जी, व्हाट डू यू से? चरणप्रीत, आकाश, जसप्रीत, मनिंदर, नरेश, साहिल, समीर, शिवम, सौरभ, विशाल. So I'm sure you have maybe friends abroad or at least someone who's living abroad, right? So what you would notice in those families, the subsequent generations, they're not much linked with their, they're not much connected with their mother tongue, right? Unko obviously born and brought up there, they do not get a chance to speak in Punjabi, and not all families insist on, speaking in the mother tongue while they're home, right? So the kids might understand, but they cannot speak. Now the next generation might not even be able to understand the same, क्योंकि वो लैंग्वेज वहां पे यूज नहीं हो रही है, ग्रेजुअली वो वैनिश हो जाएगी, राइट? इसीलिए सेम इज ट्रू फॉर कल्चर. इफ यू अप्लाई दिस वेरी माइक्रो एग्जांपल टू दिस macro concept of culture, the same is true for the same. If these all these concepts, all these ideas which include traditional knowledge, if they're not used, if they're not disseminated, if they're not shared with the next generation, and the next generation do not value the same, then gradually we are at a risk of losing the same one day. All right, so that is the social context why this is important. Now another two aspects of traditional knowledge, right? So the practical basis, traditional explanations of environmental phenomena, winds or water currents, for example, are based on cumulative collective experience tested over centuries by people who had a sophisticated and practical knowledge of the land on which they depended for every aspect of life, right? So now whatever explanations they have for the environmental phenomena, if we take, the weather, whether it will rain today or not, when will it snow, how are the days going to be, whether it is going to get hotter or colder. So इसका क्या बेस था? सभी लोगों के एक्सपीरियंस पे बेस था कि what do they believe in, right? So if they were able to reach certain explanations, certain principles for why things happen, what was behind it? Cumulative experience. सभी पूरी community का experience, not just one person coming up and saying this is how things happen. No, it was the whole community experiencing it. It was the whole community testing it, right? And that has of course been tested over centuries. ठीक है, एक सेंचुरी से कोई चीज, कोई एक्सपेरिमेंट सक्सेसफुल हो रहा है, कोई प्रिंसिपल टेस्ट हो रहा है, प्रूव हो रहा है, देन यू कैन रिलाई ऑन इट, राइट, टू बी ट्रू, टू बी साइंटिफिकली साउंड. Now by people who had a sophisticated and practical knowledge of the land on which they depended for every aspect of life. So even not just the land, even the whole environment, the nature around them, so they were dependent on nature only for every aspect of life, for their survival, right? सारे रिसोर्सेज कहाँ से मिलने हैं? नेचर से मिलने हैं, ठीक है. Now this is why they had very sophisticated and practical based knowledge. It was not simply theoretical. And second is spiritual. It is integral to the ethical beliefs and world views of indigenous people, right? So again, the traditional knowledge is also spiritual in some sense. Why? Because it is all linked. उनकी, जब उनके सर्वाइवल के साथ ही लिंक्ड है, उनकी लाइफ के साथ लिंक्ड, इट इज so deeply enmeshed with the same So this is why it becomes very important for their ethical beliefs as well. So nature को वो just not एक वो मान रहे हैं कि नेचुरल रिसोर्स है, एक गिफ्ट है, वो उसको प्रे भी करते हैं. दे ऑल्सो प्रे टू नेचर. दे ऑल्सो completely find it very reverent. Why? Because again, ethics, survival, it is all linked. Your livelihood, these are all linked concepts. So what is important for your survival? Naturally, it becomes holy for you as well. It becomes precious for you as well, right? So again, spirituality is very integral to the ethical beliefs and worldviews of indigenous people, right? So moving further, now let's talk about the impact of colonization on traditional knowledge in some detail, right? So like I told you, India has had a lot of foreign invasions. Every king, every dynasty, every house which ruled India, they brought along their own cultural aspects, right? अगर हम जम्मू कश्मीर की बात करते हैं, so Jahangir was very famous of gardens, right? So gardens were back there in their homeland, which is Persia, present day Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, that area, Central Asia. तो वहाँ पे climate अलग है, right? उसके proximity to water bodies भी है, तो वहाँ पे इतना extreme climate नहीं होता. So this is why wherever they were based in Fargana, for example. तो वहाँ पे gardens, flowers, fruits, these are all very rampant, right? So the Mediterranean sort of climate. Now Jahangir was missing the same thing, so he brought about the same culture here. So now you see all those Mughal gardens in Srinagar. We have the Nishad Bagh and we have the Shalimar Bagh, right? So on and so forth. तो वो क्या था कि जो colonizer आए, जो बाहर से rulers आए, वो अपना culture साथ लेके आए, and they try to establish the same. But till some time it was occurring in a very harmonious manner. They were not deliberately trying to destroy the native culture here, right? So एक native culture में ही बाहर का culture mix हो रहा था, and this is why India is so diverse कि यहाँ पे different types of cultures are there. However, things changed when the British came into the scene. Now, what was their idea? They had come with this motive of exploiting the natural resources, right? So अगर आपने, if you have read history, you would know 19th century was the age of invasion, of colonization, right? Age of expansion. तो उसमें क्या था, हमारी जैसे ही सबकी नेविगेशन, जैसे कि सबकी शिप बिल्डिंग, जो ये हमारी एक कह लो नेवल इंडस्ट्री है, ये बेटर हुई. दे स्टार्टेड एक्सप्लोरिंग लैंड्स बियॉन्ड व्हाट वाज इमीडिएटली क्लोज टू देम. अमेरिका डिस्कवर हो गए, साउथ अमेरिका डिस्कवर हो गए, देन द कैरिबियन आइलैंड्स, देन सिमिलरली अफ्रीका, इंडिया, एशिया. दे डिस्कवर्ड सो मेनी न्यू लैंड्स एंड दे डिस्कवर्ड कि यहाँ पे तो कितने सारे नेचुरल रिसोर्सेज हैं, राइट? एंड दे आर जस्ट वेटिंग टू बी एक्सप्लॉइटेड. कि वहां के नेटिव लोग तो इतना उसे यूज ही नहीं कर रहे. उनको लगता था कि नेटिव लोग जो है वो तो बहुत ही ज्यादा अभी ओल्ड फैशन है, पिछले जमाने में ही चल रहे हैं. सो दिस इज द अपॉर्चुनिटी दे सॉ एंड दे केम हियर, राइट? नाउ व्हाट बिगैन एज कंप्लीटली प्योरली फाइनेंशियल एंड इकोनॉमिक मोटिव, it soon took, it just expanded, and it took also the shape of political domination. It took shape of complete imperialism, complete colonization. ठीक है? अदरवाइज देखो, एक होता है कि आप सिर्फ कहीं पे जा रहे हो, उस जगह की नेचुरल रिसोर्सेज कंट्रोल कर रहे हो, दैट इज इंपीरियलिज्म. कॉलोनाइजेशन इज कि आप वहां जा रहे हो, रिसोर्सेज भी कंट्रोल कर रहे हो, वहां पे उनको पॉलिटिकली भी कंट्रोल कर रहे हो, उनको कल्चरली भी कंट्रोल कर रहे हो. दिस इज व्हाट द ब्रिटिश हैड, और ग्रेजुअली दिस इज व्हाट देयर मोटिव बिकेम इन इंडिया, राइट? सो इधर नेचुरल रिसोर्सेज उन्होंने ली हैं, टेरिटरीज ली हैं, लैंड, वी हैड सो मच गोल्ड, जैसे वो कहते हैं इंडिया सोने की चिड़िया थी, राइट? सो ऑल दैट दे टुक अवे दैट वेल्थ, दे टुक अवे, दे मेड द फार्मर्स ग्रो इंडिगो ओनली. चाहे यहाँ की मतलब सॉइल उससे बहुत खराब होती है, बट दे वर नॉट बॉदर्ड बिकॉज दे वांटेड इंडिगो, राइट? सो ऑन एंड सो फोर्थ. उन्होंने फिर कल्चरली भी काफी ज्यादा मेडल किया है. दे ट्राई टू मेक अस फील इंफीरियर, राइट? कि इंडिया के में तो कोई कल्चर ही नहीं है, यहाँ पे तो कोई नॉलेज नहीं है, यहाँ पे तो कोई बुक्स नहीं है, यहाँ की कोई लिटरेचर नहीं है, राइट? काफी सिस्टमेटिक वे में उन्होंने ये चीज की है, राइट? सो इससे क्या हुआ कि ट्रेडिशनल नॉलेज पे ऑफ कोर्स काफी ज्यादा बैड इम्पैक्ट हुआ है, राइट? सो दिस इज व्हाई ऑलमोस्ट सम forms of culture they were completely lost, some form of knowledge was completely lost permanently, right? Now to execute, just notice this line here, to exploit the natural resources found in the territories of indigenous people and to execute some notion of empire or manifest destiny to solidify economic, social and political power. So if you read British, what do they think? वो उनके क्या thinking थी? that we are superior, the west is superior, east is inferior, west is more developed, east is still underdeveloped, right? So एक बहुत ही clear एक division थी, there was this dichotomy, east versus west, right? You might have, you know, heard all these quotes like the east and the west are, you know, they're never going to be united. Okay, all these things. So it was this idea of empire that British or even, you know, the Western world, all those colonizers, the Portuguese, the French, they considered themselves superior. So they considered कि ये उनकी ड्यूटी है कि उन्होंने बाकी सारे वर्ल्ड को भी मॉडर्नाइज करना है, बाकी सारे वर्ल्ड को भी उन्होंने डेवलप करना है, कि उनके ऊपर ये रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी है कि वो एक सुपीरियर रेस है, बाकी सारे बहुत इंफीरियर है, दे आर जस्ट ट्राइबल, दे आर जस्ट सैवेज पीपल. So again, this idea was also applied to this topic or this concept of traditional knowledge, right? So चाहे हमारी like we discussed so far, कि this knowledge is based on scientific sound principles. It is not कि just कुछ notions हैं या कुछ जैसे वहम है उसके ऊपर based है. No, they have a reasoning, they have a logic behind, and why it is still relevant, क्योंकि कुछ उसमें truth था, कुछ सच था, ठीक है. बट ब्रिटिश ने आके क्या किया, उन्होंने उसको डिस्ट्रॉय करने की कोशिश की, ये वाले नोशंस को डिस्ट्रॉय करने की कोशिश की, बिकॉज दे वांट द पीपल दैट दे आर रूलिंग ओवर टू कल्चरली फॉलो देम एंड गिव अप देयर ओन नेटिव कल्चर, राइट? बिकॉज कल्चरली क्या है कि वन इफ यू स्टार्ट रूलिंग सम पीपल कल्चरली, आपका इकोनॉमिक, सोशल और पॉलिटिकल रूल ऑटोमेटिकली ईजी हो जाता है, ठीक है. ब्रिटिश ने क्या किया, वो इधर वेस्टर्न कपड़े वाला ट्रेंड लेकर आए. अभी तक जो हमारा इतना वो यू नो this importance is given to English language, not to Hindi, right? This is again a result of colonization. जहाँ पे भी ब्रिटिश ने रूल किया वहाँ पे English is the dominant language now, and the let's say the native languages, they are on a decline, right? कैसे हमारे इधर ये linked है, you know, English के साथ अच्छा मतलब this person must be educated, right? So there is this certain class, you know, identification linked with this language English. So this is also just the remnants of colonization, जो उसके एक आफ्टर इफेक्ट्स आप कह सकते हो कि अभी तक चल रहे हैं, कि हम कॉलोनाइजर्स की ही लैंग्वेज बोल रहे हैं, ठीक है. टू एग्जीक्यूट सम नोशन ऑफ एम्पायर और मैनिफेस्ट डेस्टिनी. नाउ मैनिफेस्ट डेस्टिनी इज दैट इट इज देयर डेस्टिनी, इट इज देयर डिवाइन, यू नो, रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी कि उन्होंने बाकी वर्ल्ड को भी मॉडर्नाइज करना है, और वो यही जस्टिफिकेशन देते थे कि इसीलिए ही हमने इतनी कॉलोनीज पे, यू नो, वी आर जस्ट रूलिंग दोज कॉलोनीज, रूलिंग दोज पीपल, and to solidify economic, social and political power. So what started as an economic pursuit, gradually it became a social and a political pursuit as well, right? So I hope this is clear to you so far. कुछ ज्यादा आपको वेग नहीं लग रहा, कुछ ज्यादा मुश्किल नहीं लग रहा? हाँ जी. So all pretty easy to understand, easy to follow? You can reply in the chat. Otherwise, let's move forward. So colonization has adversely affected the transmission, preservation, and protection of traditional knowledge, right? So traditional knowledge has not been systematically documented until recently, right? So we all know कि इसका कोई proper documentation नहीं हुई, कोई इसके हमारे पास proper records नहीं है. It is more, you know, passed on from one generation to another. Even अगर हम अपने culture की बात करें ना, हमारे culture में भी, if you realize, there are so many things which your grandmother might be knowing but your mother might not know, right? आपको भी नहीं पता होंगी, ठीक है. एक आपके grandfather, grandmother वाली, grandparents वाली generation, then your parents generation and then your generation, तीनों generations की knowledge में बहुत फर्क होगा, ठीक है. कुछ पुरानी बातें होंगी जो दादी को पता होंगी, नानी को पता होंगी कि ऐसे होता है, दिस इज व्हाट इज डन, दिस इज हाउ वी डू इट. then your maybe your mother, your father, they are following some of those rituals, and then it is our generation and we are quite, you know, cut off from all that, क्योंकि हमें क्या लगता है, we just go in for what is the idea behind doing this, what is the reason behind doing this, what is the practical, you know, idea behind, किसका क्या यूज, क्या एप्लीकेशन क्या है. हम थोड़ा और लॉजिकली सोचते हैं, हम अपने कल्चर से थोड़ा और, मतलब हमारे लिए कल्चर का एक डिफरेंट वैल्यू है, पेरेंट्स के लिए डिफरेंट वैल्यू है, हमारे ग्रैंड पेरेंट्स के लिए कंप्लीटली डिफरेंट वैल्यू है, राइट? एंड अगेन कुछ बातें होंगी जो कि कोई डॉक्यूमेंट नहीं की हुई, कोई लिखी नहीं हुई, वो सिर्फ लोगों को पता होती है, लाइक योर दादी माइट बी जस्ट नोइंग इट बट यू वोंट बी एबल टू फाइंड इट इन एनी ऑफ द डॉक्यूमेंट्स और बुक्स. व्हाई एंड व्हाई इज दैट सो? बिकॉज जो हमारी ये ट्रेडिशनल नॉलेज है, इट इज नॉट सिस्टमेटिकली डॉक्यूमेंटेड, right? It is largely orally transmitted only by word of mouth. Like the mother tells her daughter, that the daughter passes on to her children, so on and so forth. That is how it continues. ठीक है जी. Then it has become isolated. Indigenous people have become isolated from one another. Also within the indigenous people, जो हमारे ये native people है, उनकी भी बात करें तो वो भी अभी, क्योंकि कितनी जगह पे देखो encroachment हो गई है. If we are talking about our forest, जहाँ पे tribal people they stay, right? कुछ जो tribes हैं जो अभी भी पुराने टाइम का system follow कर रहे हैं, who are still following the traditional methods, right? Their way of life is still very traditional, still very simple, uncomplicated. तो उसमें क्या है, within from each other, the groups within themselves are not so, well connected as they used to be. Why? Because कुछ कितनी सारी ह्यूमन जो हमारी मॉडर्न लाइफ की, अर्बन लाइफ की, वहाँ पे इंटरफेरेंस हो गई है, कंस्ट्रक्शन एक्टिविटीज हो रही हैं, डेवलपमेंट वर्क्स हो रहे हैं, तो उनसे इन सब एक्टिविटीज से इनकी लाइफ पे भी बहुत असर पड़ रहा है, राइट? सो इवन विद इन देम दे आर मोर आइसोलेटेड फ्रॉम ईच अदर. Then enforced shifts away from traditional subsistence practices, right? Now because see, with the coming of technology things have changed. अगर हम यहाँ पे एग्जांपल लेते हैं एग्रीकल्चर, पहले टाइम पे एग्रीकल्चर वाज डन completely by hand, manual labor, no implements, no machines were used, no combines or harvesters were used. अभी क्या है, सारी जगह पे ये न्यू मशीन्स आ गई हैं जिससे कि आप ज्यादा काम कर सकते हो इन लेसर टाइम. ठीक है, तो आपका जिस काम को पहले 3-4 दिन लगते थे, मे बी इट इज जस्ट अ मैटर ऑफ फ्यू आवर्स टुडे, राइट? विद द कंबाइंस, हार्वेस्टर्स, टिलर्स एंड व्हाट नॉट, के सीड डालने के लिए भी ड्रिल है, सो ऑन एंड सो फोर्थ. अब क्या है कि इससे जो हमारी सबसिस्टेंस प्रैक्टिस है वो उतनी सस्टेनेबल नहीं है, उतनी प्रॉफिटेबल नहीं है. ठीक है जी, बड़ी फैमिली है, they have to survive from a limited piece of land, right? So they have to use these modern techniques so that they can get the maximum out of that particular land. ठीक है, उसी land से उनकी maximum कह लो फसल हो सके, right? So this has enforced a shift away from traditional subsistence practices. So इसका agriculture is just one example. This is true for several other fields as well. Let's say manufacturing. ठीक है, कोई भी आपकी और activities है उसमें भी ये चीज apply होती है. Then health and social problems, right? अब जो हमारी इतनी इंडस्ट्रियलाइजेशन से पोल्यूशन तो इंक्रीज हो ही रहा है, ठीक है, तो वो पोल्यूशन भी ये वाले ग्रुप्स तक पहुंच रहा है जिनका अभी तक लाइफ बहुत प्योर था, बहुत अनकॉम्प्लिकेटेड था, बट दे आल्सो हैव टू contend with these modern world problems, right? Similarly, there are social disturbances as well. There is a social imbalance, right? People are fighting for land which is limited. Then there is this hierarchy, who is of more, जिसका higher social status है, जिसका lower social status है. All these problems are also affecting the, let's say, the preservation of our traditional knowledge. Then dominance of Western scientific traditions, right? So Western scientific, now colonization has of course brought in their own scientific ideas and principles. एक होता है कि आप आइडिया लेकर आते हो, that idea is shared with everyone and it is up to the people whether they want to adopt it or not. You give it time, ये कब तक, when does it become more widespread, when does it has wider acceptance. एक होता है आप उसको impose करते हो. Now what did the British do, what did the colonizers do in their respective colonies? They imposed those ideas and that led to a gradual erasure of the traditional methods, right? So जो भी traditionally कुछ भी scientific method use हो रहे थे, they were forced out of usage, they were forced out of practice. And क्योंकि एक बार जब आप कोई काम चीज कर ही नहीं रहे हो, gradually आपको skill भूल जाओगे, right? अगर simple example है, if you have learned to play the piano or the guitar, अगर आप उसकी रेगुलर प्रैक्टिस नहीं करोगे आपको भूल जाएगा. सिमिलरली इफ यू आर लर्निंग अ न्यू लैंग्वेज, अगर आप उस लैंग्वेज को यूज ही नहीं कर रहे, आपको वो लैंग्वेज भूल जाएगी. सिमिलरली अगर हम अपने ट्रेडिशनल जो मेथड्स हैं, ट्रेडिशनल नॉलेज है, इसको अप्लाई नहीं कर रहे, इसको यूज नहीं कर रहे, ये डॉक्यूमेंटेड तो है नहीं, सो इट इज ऑब्वियसली गोइंग टू वैनिश इनटू ऑब्लिवियन, राइट? So these are what various points which we discussed related to what colonization, what impact has colonization had on traditional knowledge, its preservation, transmission and protection, right? So health and social problems में हम आप British rule को link करोगे, how they came and created a social problem here as well. They used to co-opt one community against another. पहले एक side की आपने एक community की side ले लेनी है, उनको दूसरे के अगेंस्ट कर देना है, फिर आपने क्या करना है, इनका साथ छोड़ देना है, दूसरे की साइड ले लेनी है, उनको फेवर कर देना है. बट आपने क्या किया, एक बार दोनों कम्युनिटीज में लड़ाई तो करवा दी. You sowed the seeds of discord, right? If you are familiar with Indian history, the history of India's freedom struggle, so Bengal tha, it was a huge state. Present day Bangladesh was also included in Bengal. What happened? They divided it. ठीक है, उसकी डिवीजन कर दी. आइडिया क्या था? लोगों को डिवाइड करना. एक हिंदू मुस्लिम वाली जो कम्युनल पॉलिटिक्स है, ये स्टार्ट ही ब्रिटिश ने की है. That is how they started this idea. You know, the idea of having a separate state of Pakistan, the separate country of Pakistan, that was again, you know, promoted and very systematically introduced by British rulers, right? It was not, you know, endemic to India or Indian people. जो हमारे इधर के freedom fighters थे, they never had this idea at first, but gradually the British, they made them see how this can be, let's say advantageous to you, how this can be profitable to you, how this is the only solution. ऐसे कर करके उन्होंने बहुत systematically काफी साल लगा के इस आइडिया को एक प्रमोट किया, right? So this again you can link this with health and social problems which have, you know, come up due to British or colonial rule, right? So I think हमने काफी ज्यादा डिटेल में देख लिया how has colonization affected transmission, preservation and protection of traditional knowledge, right? So we'll continue on this in the next class. So I believe we have a class tomorrow. So हम इसको कल conclude करेंगे. I don't want to start with this because this will take time, right? So any doubts or any questions you might have, anything you might want to ask? So just for your information, see, all the lectures are recorded and they are put on YouTube, right? So I'll share the YouTube link with you. So आप क्या कर सकते हो in case like we just had this, you know, even I'm getting this message that my connection is unstable. Similarly, you were not able to hear me clearly for some time. तो उससे क्या है, you can always go to YouTube and refer to that lecture there. कुछ भी अगर आपका part कहीं कहीं पे miss हो जाता है due to network issues at your end or at mine, you can always go back and check the lecture on YouTube. All right. So anything else you might want to discuss or ask? So is that all for today? So I think we meet at the same time tomorrow, 5th lecture. Right. So that was all. Thank you for attending the class and see you all tomorrow.